It requires governments to do many things. First, governments must invest in human resources for health so that there are health workers close to people. They must also invest in a social protection floor so that people who want services can buy services. It's not good enough to have services when they cannot afford it. And the final point is supply chains management system. So if you are going to provide services, you must also provide supplies. So when they need drugs or they need supplies to provide health, they'll be there to do it. I think it's important for us to be able to provide good nutritional advice to young people so they eat well, balanced diet. They eat enough fruits, they eat enough vegetables, and they have a balanced diet with micronutrients. I think it's important. So those are things that we can do. And young people need to know about their bodies, so comprehensive sexuality education and access to services, so we can prevent many things. And I'll give you an example. Today, the highest incidence of HIV occurs in the adolescent girls in Africa. They are the ones who suffer most. So if we can prevent that and we can give them the information, the knowledge, and the services to prevent it, we'll have done a great thing. I think with government, if government puts their mind to it, yes, because most of the things we're talking about here are things we are doing at this point in time. So governments, civil society, the private sector just need to be a lot more organized. And it's not expensive. It's just the fact that we need motivation and we need leadership and we need political will to put resources where it does matter. And if we do it, we'll get there.
All right, our short video presentation, I think that is done. And so we will move to the next presentation. And this will be a presentation by the United Nations Population Fund, UNFPA. And this will deal with access to sexual and reproductive health services by adolescents in the OECS, a situation analysis. And this will be done by Ms. Alison Drayton, who is the director of the UNFPA Caribbean. Alison Drayton is the director and representative of the United Nations Population Fund Sub-Regional Office for the Caribbean. Prior to joining UNFPA in 2016, Alison was in the United Nations Development Program for 15 years. During her time in UNDP, Alison managed the drafting of the 2016 Caribbean Human Development Report, which focused on multidimensional progress in the Caribbean. Before joining UNDP in 2001, Allison was a diplomat in Guyana's permanent mission to the United Nations. During that time, as chairman of the Group of 77 and China, she led in global negotiations on climate change, oceans management, tourism, and other critical issues on the development agenda. I want you to welcome again Miss Alison Drayton.
Morning again. The results that
Okay.
Sorry.
Just to interrupt for a brief moment, for those sitting on this side, we would want you to fill up where possible the tables around, the chairs around the tables.
Last year at a meeting in Trinidad in which we constituted a forum of Caribbean parliamentarians on population development issues. At the request of those who were there, Minister Brandy Williams was one. I committed to doing a mapping of the sexual and reproductive legislation in the Caribbean. That study is nearly concluded. We have drawn from the initial drafts to share with you some of the findings that we have to situate the discussions going forward today in some of the data that is there. So just a quick reminder on, in terms of the 17 SDGs, UNFPA situates our 3 transformative results, mainly against 5 of them. They're up in the screen. So that is kind of global context. Moving now to the region, the what, the who, and the why in the Caribbean. The causes of adolescent pregnancy, and I'm sure any one of you, if prompted, could kind of reel off at least a third to a half of these. But just a reminder that, okay, we get to the point of it's low use of contraceptives, including condoms. You can't address this without looking at what gets you there. And a lot of it is around norms and attitudes, the refusal almost across the board, if not across the board, in schools to deal with sex education. So certainly in some of the countries, Guyana being one of them, you have children sometimes as young as 9 getting pregnant. They will get pregnant again because they have had the baby and they cannot tell you the process by which reproduction happened because they've never had that discussion. And we have some alarmingly high rates of early sexual debut. So you take all of that together, you kind of end up with that capture. Linking back to the points that both Minister Brantley and Joanne Messiah made, it's not just about health. It's health in the context of economic development. UNFPA's lens in the Caribbean is around adolescent pregnancy because this region, while the rates are dropping, it's still very high. And I would say it is one of the primary contributors to poverty in the region. If you think of the life cycle, I mean, let me be clear. Usually, those who get pregnant and carry and have the child are from the lower socioeconomic status. Middle class everywhere in the world and above tends to have access to solutions to their problems. So what we, sorry, next slide, please. So what we look at when we're looking at what is the link to the negative impact on development, you have school dropouts. If they do go back into school, they're going to come out with maybe just what my generation would have called A-levels, which means only low-skilled jobs, or they don't go back into school, so they have real issues with employment. Why do I care if I'm Minister of Finance? That's less tax revenue. That is an increased cost on healthcare and social welfare. In this region, we have a rapidly aging population with major health issues, social protection and health systems that are already overstretched, and we're dropping below fertility rates in the region, as you'll see when I get to the next couple of slides, which means that where I have the growth in my population is not the piece of the population that is contributing to that base that I need. There are psychological effects, there are effects on the children, there are poor SRH outcomes, and then often for some of these girls, there are repeated pregnancies because pregnancy becomes an economic option for them. And then I think very seldom discussed, because we look at these very much, we tend to have the discussion in the region through the lens of the impact on girls. But I have in my network a number of male friends who became fathers at a young age and who shouldered their responsibilities. That has had severe consequences on their ability to earn. That is something that we also don't factor in. Not all men like to have multiple babies and abandon them. So, the economic consequences fall on both genders, disproportionately on girls, absolutely, but we do need to keep in mind not only. So looking now at some of the data that has come out of the mapping, and you'll be hearing more on this tomorrow, but it is true that in the region we have a decreasing trend in the total fertility ratio and hence in population growth, with several of the countries falling below replacement fertility. We have longer life expectancy at birth. As I've said, then when we start considering the issue of adolescent pregnancy and access to services, it is to keep in mind that the negative, not just the negative social, but negative economic consequences of all of that coming together are pretty severe. This is the Caribbean mapped against North, Central, and South America in terms of adolescent fertility rates. And as you can see, we have a downward trend. So, kudos to all of the policymakers in the region. We see a definite change between 1990 and 2015. But I would point out that if you look at we're still at the lower end of the graph at 28.3%. That is still too high by global norms. And if you look at it against the rest of the Americas, yes, their lower end of the graph is higher than ours, but their fall has been, no, sorry, my bad math. Our fall has been bigger. Ignore that last comment. I'm numerically dyslexic. Alas. Adolescent fertility rate, please, next slide. Thank you. Adolescent fertility rate broken down by the countries. The OECS countries highlighted in yellow where we have the information. And you can see within the OECS, St. Lucia and St. Vincent and the Grenadines have amongst the highest adolescent fertility rates in the OECS. I would also mention that Latin America and the Caribbean globally has the second highest rates of adolescent pregnancies after sub-Saharan Africa. So please, across the next couple of days, let us challenge ourselves to think how if anybody has to speak to you in 3 years' time, that sentence is not going to be part of the presentation. This looks at the unmet need for family planning. And again, we've highlighted the OECS countries, so you can find yourselves in the yellow. There are important disparities between the countries. So what I noted looking at this, which was interesting, is of the two that lead in the OECS on adolescent pregnancies, which is St. Lucia and St. Vincent and the Grenadines, then when you look at the unmet need for family planning, there's a bigger unmet need in St. Lucia than there is in St. Vincent, which is actually pretty high up relatively on meeting the need. So again, from a policy perspective, that's an important data point to consider in the countries. I always say that from the outside, the Caribbean looks very homogeneous, but it's not when you get to the country level. So there are clearly some important differences in terms of access, but how that translates into rates or does not. To give a sense now, and this points to the importance of disaggregated data, we broke out for 3 countries, Belize, Guyana, and St. Lucia, in terms of the unmet need for family planning, looking across the age cohorts. I regret that it was not possible to plot St. Lucia on the 15 to 24 piece of the graph because the data set was too small. But if I may say, Senator Isaacs, what I find fascinating about St. Lucia, and I'd love to understand, is it is an anomaly in that the unmet need for family planning goes up very, well, not sharply, but significantly in the 34 to 49 age cohort, which is unusual. In the other 2 countries, it continues to come down. So, an interesting point to explore. In terms of Guyana and Belize, what the graph shows very sharply is that the greatest unmet need is, again, with adolescents, 15 to 29. From a policy perspective, something very important to take into account. And keeping in mind, as I think 2 of the speakers this morning pointed out, the Caribbean, we love to lead, sometimes not in the most positive areas. Again, second only to sub-Saharan Africa in terms of our HIV rates. And as was mentioned this morning, 1/3 of the new infections are coming from the 15 to 24 age cohort. Again, linking this back to the economic dimension, think about what that means as a stress on health services across the life of that person. And based on data from PANCAP and UNAIDS collected as recently as 2018, what we have found is almost half of the young people in this region in that 15 to 24 cohort do not have adequate HIV knowledge. I come back to my point about the failure to deliver sex education in school and the very severe consequences of that decision. And 2 in 5 young people in that cohort did not use condoms the last time they had sex. I'm going to go out here on a limb and assume that that means that they never use condoms when they have sex. And then early sexual debut in this region is 56% for girls and 79% of boys, on average, have had sex before the age of 14. I will remind that along with taxes, sex is something that everybody lies about. So again, I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that that figure is underestimating. And I always find it interesting. We are an increasingly conservative region, but it is clear if you look at this data that the conservatism that is social is not being reflected in behavior and mores. Moving on, and we've put these two slides in here because the issue of early termination of pregnancy is a very vibrant discussion in a number of the countries, and sometimes a very divisive one. They are, again, in Jamaica, where I'm headquartered, having a discussion in Parliament on this. This slide looks at, out of the Caribbean, it's Belize, Guyana, French Guyana, mapped against countries in South and Central America. The only two countries in the region that have legislation on access to abortion are Guyana and Barbados. And if you look at the data on Guyana, and I do think this is an important point to recognize, for those who feel that access means that, you know, people then resort to abortion as a form of birth control, you look at the numbers in Guyana, this is clearly not the case. Guyana is the light, limeish green line. It falls like a stone. Guyana adopted the Termination of Pregnancy Act in 1995. In 1996, they did have a very high number of abortions. 7,711 were recorded. Keep in mind that was the year after the act was adopted, and it takes time for legislation to kind of move in and be internalized. In 2015, 2015, which is the last year for which we have data, only 212 cases were reported. That is not an insignificant point. And if you ask why do we care because we believe every childbirth should be safe. We care deeply about maternal health and survival. And when abortions are not legally available, it doesn't mean that people don't default to them, and you tend to have more catastrophic outcomes. In a similar vein, this is a breakdown of abortion safety categories by the sub-region of Latin America and the Caribbean, and on the right side of the table, we've also looked at it against countries that have access to abortion, and what you will see is that where that access is, the number of unsafe abortions are so low they're almost insignificant in the ability to graph. So sharing that information for consideration. The next slide looks at the legal framework in the OECS. You see the minimum age of consent for sexual activity in the middle of the middle column, and the minimum age to access services without parental or guardian consent in the right. Please note that in not a single country, no, I lie, in St. Vincent and the Grenadines is the only country where there is some correlation between the minimum age of consent and the ability to access. I personally find it astonishing that we consider that girls can have, well, girls and boys can have sex at 15 or 16, but they cannot determine the outcome of that until they're 18. And that two-year gap is, if I may be frank, shameful. And then to also note that in both St. Kitts and Nevis and St. Vincent and the Grenadines, legislation is not gender neutral. So in St. Kitts and Nevis, it's 16 for girls. There's no comment on boys whatsoever. And I know that, globally, this is not a Caribbean problem. There is a view that, if a girl of 13 has sex with an adult, it's a form of molestation. But if a boy of 13 has sex with an adult, lucky him. Not the case. That leaves deep psychological scars on both genders. Something to consider. So I do urge you, as you're discussing policy, to also keep that slide very much in mind, because I think that is an area that is ripe for some decisions. Moving now to the call for action and what are some of the policy decisions that could be considered. The Caribbean sits on a very rich policy framework. Much of it either helped shape or has legally acceded to. So the legislation has a very rich and well-respected basis in the region. Moving now to, and I'm going to move through this quickly, the presentation will be available, some of the things that policymakers can do. Reduce marriage before the age of 18, though personally what I would like to see as a major priority is actually lowering the age at which young people can access services. Marriage also important, but access to services well up there as well. Support pregnancy prevention programs among adolescents, increase the use of contraception, reduce coerced sex, there's more of it than we like to recognize, reduce unsafe abortions, increase the use of skilled antenatal, childbirth, and postpartum care, ensure school continuation of adolescent mothers, and may I say this has been one of the areas in the region in which we have, at least in Jamaica and Guyana, there may be a couple of other countries where we have seen very robust policies put into place in terms of the reintegration of young mothers into schools, and ensure a comprehensive prevention and response to GBV. As I said, a growing problem in this region, but I would also say that we need to also keep in mind that sex between an adult and an adolescent is a form of gender-based violence, of course, sex. I put this slide in here because when I met Minister Brantley last year, one of the concerns he'd raised with me is that for a number of countries in the Caribbean, but particularly the OECS, the countries are falling below the replacement fertility rate. So it's not often that I get asked what a government can do from a policy front to encourage more childbirth. But I did take that as a serious question through the lens of social development. And so here is a partial response. I hope that you will all add to it. But noting that in this region we have a major problem with youth unemployment. And that affects decisions. So young people are more likely to start or expand their families if they have decent jobs. If governments can advance the array and reach of family planning policies, such as paid parental leave, flexible work hours, and affordable housing, that helps. And expand access to free or affordable child care. We are very fortunate in the region that most of us come from families, there's a network, there's always someone you can drop your child off at. Unless you're me, my mother to me, darling, happy to have you visit. Looking forward to seeing you leave. If I come with child. She's not a child person. What is at stake? I come back to the points that Minister Brantley reminded us this morning. What is at stake is the region's ability to achieve the SDGs. These issues around adolescent pregnancy, access to services, maternal health, in our view, this is one of the accelerators for the region. And as I said, when you track this also against the aging population, against youth unemployment, and against NCDs, needing to deal with all of these things within the remit of health, but not only, are crucial if the region is going to accelerate. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Ms. Drayton from UNFPA. And that organization, of course, you would have heard, would have been a very, very strong sponsor of this 3-day forum. Thanks again. We will have another presentation advocating together for the SDGs, repositioning our education system to overcome gender stereotypes and break down the gender divide. To do this presentation will be Dr. Halima Deshong, head of the Institute of Gender and Development Studies at the University of the West Indies, Keyville. Please welcome Dr. Deshong.
Thank you very much, Chair. It's not often I have to pull the mic up. I usually have to pull it down, so I feel a little proud about that. Good morning, everyone, and I feel, again, really grateful to be here. Thank you for the invitation from the administration here in Nevis. I wish to extend thanks to the Ministry of Health and Gender Affairs, as well as the Ministry of Culture, Youth, Sports, and Telecommunications and Information, and also to say a heartfelt word of thanks to UNFPA and the Parliamentarians for sponsoring this event. So I come to you with this presentation as someone committed to gender, economic, and social justice, and my experience mainly lies in gender analysis. I want to spend some time discussing the value of applying an anti-colonial intersectional gender analysis for rethinking our social systems, in this case, the education system, as well as the relations which reproduce certain kinds of inequality. While I come to this presentation as someone who's been an educator since the age of 18, I'm also quite aware that we have experts in education, science, administration, and reform. So I'm very cautious with some of my comments on education. The topic that I was assigned was repositioning our education system to overcome gender stereotypes and break down the gender divide. And I thought it was a mouthful, so I abbreviated. I think really one of the reasons why I abbreviated as well is because I think that some of the challenges we face may be better understood as questions of unequal relations of power based on gender, race, class, ability, disability, and other forms of difference. In other words, gender stereotypes are symptomatic of broader, uneven systemic arrangements of power with a long-run historical antecedents that must be confronted and redressed. And I think Minister Masai, the Honorable Joanne Masai this morning in her presentation did well to highlight some of these interlocking, uneven relations of power. It is for this reason I have slightly adjusted, and so my topic then is creating a gender-just education system or experience. And for this presentation, I will be, as you are aware, I will be focusing specifically on SDG 4 and 5, quality education and gender equality. And thinking about the interconnectivity across the 17 Sustainable Development Goals, I think it's very well exemplified in terms of the goal for gender equality as well as quality education. So I want to spend some time just briefly talking about the emergence of education in the Caribbean, the state of Caribbean education, and the value of applying the kind of analysis to which I spoke of earlier. So I also bring greetings from the principal of the Caville campus, Professor Udine Barreto, who has spent much of her career theorizing gender systems in the Caribbean. And I just want to say a little bit about that to add to much of what has been said before. And so in her work, she looks specifically at the ways in which we produce in our societies very complex relations of power, to which women and men are socially created and maintained, and the ways in which we tend to allocate resources, valuing, rewarding, as well as punishment, depending on whether or not persons are able to adhere to or whether they depart from these systems of power. And so one of the things she says in her work is that gender systems often encode or they mask and these relations of power because they present them as natural and normal. And so she argues that we have to think about gender as operating at both the ideological level, our belief systems, as well as the kind of material ways in which we feel these uneven ideas about power. And so in the next slide, there's a situation we have in the Caribbean in which young women tend to be more unemployed. There are higher rates of unemployment among young women when compared to young men. And some of this, there's a lot of work going on in the region and elsewhere about youth not in education or in employment, NEET youth. And one of the things that they notice is that one of the main reasons given for young women occupying this category in greater numbers than men has to do with women's engagement in care work. And sometimes this is not voluntary. This is sometimes forced, depending on family situations, caring for the elderly. You might be caring for someone with a disability that gives, because of mobility. It might be sick care. And oftentimes that care economy is not valued, we know, in the same kind of way as the paid economy. So I just wanted to give that as an example. And I want to say that say as well that when I talk about, you could go forward. When I talk about creating a gender just education system, I'm thinking about in particular what Barreto also calls creating the conditions under which there are no hierarchies of difference. So the issue that we have in gender, when we talk about doing a gender analysis, is not so much that gender, that we want to make everybody the same, because we are different. Is that we want to sort of have disappear the differential valuing of women and men or gender non-conforming citizens in the Caribbean. And I think it's really important for us to understand that. So for her, a gender-just society is one in which there are no hierarchies of identities or meanings given to masculinity and femininity. That's what she calls a gender-just system. And that's what I'm thinking about in terms of thinking about the education system. Next slide. So I want us to think a little bit about the significant achievements we've had. We've had some significant achievements in education, which I'll get back to. Civic participation, autonomy and choice, expansion of role, and economic participation. But there are some areas that we're still lagging behind, and our speakers spoke about them before: women's political participation, women's labor force participation, the unfair burden of care, and a very big on the agenda is violence and insecurity. So for us, in doing a gender analysis, I talked about us needing to apply this approach to thinking about what is happening in our education system, that we're not just looking at sex disaggregated data and thinking about how many boys or how many girls appear or how many men and women are appearing at the tertiary level, but thinking about the class relations and race relations and gendered relations that produce particular outcomes. Okay, so I'm going to just move a bit ahead because I know we've been running a little behind. So if you could go forward again, back. Right. So thinking about our colonial education system, and why I start there, I think some of us will be surprised as to the extent to which we hold on to a number of vestiges of colonialism in our education system. And it might be useful to think about where we all started. So the modern education system in Barbados and other parts of the Caribbean Caribbean actually came out of a number of recommendations. And a large part of that had to do with thinking about creating this social buffer between the white plantocracy and the formerly enslaved Africans on plantations. And it had nothing to do with the uplift of the large majority of people who were seen as labor for Caribbean economies. It had very little to do with the uplift of, marginalized groups in the region, and it had to do with social stability. And in many ways, our education system continues to be marked by this notion of, Britishness, Englishness, and social stability. Next slide. Right. So the Colonial Office sought to create a small, educated, non-white class to serve a social buffer between the agro-commercial bourgeoisie and the masses, according to Aviston Downs. And so if we trace back, the first emergence of school, the first school that was built in that time, in 1743, was actually built for the son of planters who could not afford, because of the downturn in the sugar plantation economy, could not afford to send their boys to England, and not their girls, their boys to England. And then the defining, so that had little to do, again, with, thinking about the broader society. And if we think about, by the time we get to the 1900s and schools are beginning to emerge, they're mostly boys' schools, and they're mostly training boys in, the classics and mathematics and so on. And when girls' schools then did emerge, they're training girls to become homemakers and so on. So that's kind of the legacy that we have been bequeathed in terms of trying to refashion and change an education system. So I want to kind of use back. Yes. So I want to use a study that was done by my sister unit on the Mona campus, the Regional Coordinating Office of the IGDS, to think about the ways in which we continue to embed principles of gender inequality as well as racial inequality in our textbooks. So they did a study looking at history textbooks in the Caribbean that are used in CSEC and CXC examinations. And what they found, textbooks, like any other media, tend to produce meaning about the world that it seeks to represent, and as such can be very inimical to social change. And so in their review of over 30 history textbooks currently being used, they found there's particular kinds of harmful assumptions about race, gender, and class that operate in ways that create subordinate position for certain groups of persons. They also found that of the 1,118 images reviewed, 58% depicted male characters, while only 14.1% depicted female characters. And you might ask, so why does that matter? But the symbolism matters because we need to see ourselves reflected in the things that we are being taught. And they also found that in approximately 90% of cases in which girls and women are mentioned, they are contextualizing stereotypical roles. This was the case for only 26% of boys and men. And so, in addition to that, what one scholar has argued, Orsolia Koreski, is that the hidden curriculum has an identity-forming role since it mediates the gender-specific expectations, norms, and behavior, and therefore it contributes to the reproduction of social inequalities. And Barbara Bailey, who was has done quite a bit of work on gender in education in the Caribbean, goes on to say that one aspect of the hidden curriculum through which gender stereotypes are transmitted is the support print materials used to support the delivery, of curricula at all levels. The images portrayed in the curriculum materials are powerful and effective tools of socialization, as we know. And so there's a way in which, if we kind of drill down to different parts of the education system, there is need to ensure that our texts embed difference and diversity. And so what might this mean in terms of producing a gender-just education system? And I just pose a couple of questions and prompts for us to think about. The need to anchor change within these broad shifts that must occur across the Caribbean society. And what I mean by that is that the education system is not in a vacuum. The education system is part of something larger, and so as such, a gender-just society is a prerequisite for a gender-just education system. So what are the we think about how, for instance, does education either engender or reproduce change within our Caribbean gender systems is another area I want us to think about, but also thinking about the current labor, if we drill down a little bit more, thinking about the current labor market conditions under which we operate and whether our education system is performing the kind of socially formative role necessary in preparing persons for the workforce. But beyond thinking about the workforce, I want to kind of draw on a Rastafari knowledge resource in thinking about a space for reimagining Caribbean liberties. As we think about our education system, I think in many ways we are invested in notions of civilization, and a lot of the work that is happening now at the curriculum level and at the university level is asking hard questions within the region and in the context of the globe in terms of the kind of reparative work that is necessary. So I think that conversation needs to happen in education as well. Thinking about engendering both ideological shifts and material shifts, that is what our education system should be doing for us. And it should be a revolutionary space for different kind of imagination. Thinking about driving innovation and economic growth. And a large part of that has to do, a significant proportion of our CARICOM heads of governments, for instance, if we think about our education system. We think about education at the higher level. Higher levels of education within the region serves to prepare graduates for taking leadership roles in government. A significant proportion of our heads of government, past and present, have been educated in this region. So it's important for us to think about the strengths of our education system, even as we try to revolutionize. So in thinking about the strengths, we have in the Caribbean almost universal primary education across member states. There's an average school, and this is being highlighted as a strength because the average school leaving age was very low for a long time because a number of children in many decades ago were not attending school because they were in the labor market. And that still happens, and I'll talk about that a bit shortly for some communities in the Caribbean. There's need for collaboration on regional examination certificate. That we have a Caribbean examination council that collaborates on a regional examination and certificate system. We have expanded access to university and programs at the A-level and associate degree level. But I want us to kind of think about what some of the challenges are. In many ways, the challenges... There's success in the education system, whether we like to admit it or not, continues to be tied to our contingent on performance at large-scale formal examination granting entry into secondary schools, even in instances where member states have implemented universal secondary education policies. And I think this argument has been raging for quite some time in the region. The possibilities for zoning students are compromised by hierarchies which exist among older secondary schools and newer secondary schools, with older secondary schools often receiving far more state support than newer secondary schools. And this elitism we have among schools in the region perpetuates prevents us from thinking about alternatives to organizing our school systems. Another challenge is that even with greater emphasis being placed on technical and vocational education, there is further need to ensure greater alignment between technical and academic education in response to the very labor market requirements that we are concerned about. There's also need to rethink the emphasis on major testing as a key form of assessment and to ensure we address the stigmatization of technical and vocational education and training as the preserve of students who are less academically inclined. Similar programs in other parts of the world are seen as essential for university graduates who need specific skills to enhance opportunities in labor markets. And I want to say this against recent concern about CXC performance at the CXC level, which is the next slide. And so in 2009 CSEC exams, only 21% of candidates sitting the examination achieved acceptable grades in 5 or more subjects. 52% of them either did not pass any subject or received acceptable grades in only 1 subject. According to the then head of the Dr. Didikal Strules, who is now heading the OECS, but was at the time registrar of the Caribbean Examination Council, he says that attention to quality and performance is the most urgent of imperatives facing us at the secondary level. The Caribbean actually lags chronically behind the so-named developing countries in rates of participation by youth in the tertiary education system. While 2/3 of youth aged 18 to 24 are registered at tertiary institutions in developed countries, the Caribbean has the lowest tertiary education enrollment rates in the West, with figures ranging from only 2% to the highest being 22%, and the 22% is in the Dominican Republic. So and in fact, when we kind of think about this against the concern we have, the very low rates at which boys are entering tertiary education, at university we have something like a statistic of the number of students that are women being 70%, with 30% being men on most campuses. When we match that against the fact that less than 10% of our youth are accessing tertiary education, then we begin to see this is a problem of youth and not a problem of boys. Because oftentimes we talk about boys being left out, but we often miss the class analysis that needs to happen in terms of the level of participation at both the secondary and the tertiary level. Next slide. Back. So, CARICOM's Council for Human Development has agreed on the development of a regional strategic action plan that presents a harmonized approach to education reform in the Caribbean to ensure the proper functioning of the system regionally and nationally, and a number of other things. And there are some key things that persons like Didikal Strules suggest, that we can't just tinker with the system, we need to revolutionize the system because education systems are ecosystem. You can't just focus on teaching or focus on curriculum, focus on content and so on. You have to think about the actual operation, right? Because it has so many moving parts. He talks about the implication of internationalization, the idea of preparing students for a global marketplace, and a number of other things. But I want to move on to thinking about some of those, get back to some of those concerns about gender differential in education. Next slide. So there has been much concern about what has been labeled by some as apathy on the path of men and boys toward formal education, particularly at the tertiary level. Next slide. There is much concern as well that girls are outperforming, where, as I said before, the reality is that the education system is not working for most of our youth. And thinking about what this means, next slide, in terms of our access, we think about the fact that we do have a problem in terms of access by indigenous youth in the region to education, particularly indigenous girls. Economically marginalized youth have far less access to education as we move past the primary level. Young men at secondary and post-secondary levels, and a lot of that, apart from the fact that they're mostly economically marginalized boys, we also have the issue of the ways in which we construct and produce ideas about masculinity in ways that are inimical to seeing education as a means to which to progress for boys in particular. So boys are seeking to, and young men are seeking to enter labor markets as soon as they finish their secondary education. They are not necessarily seeing tertiary education as a means to which to access wealth, as a means to which to access finances and so on. So we have to think about what that means and why is this different for that under 10% of girls when compared to that under 10% of boys, because we're still talking about a very small group of Caribbean youth. And then, of course, we have to think about how our education system is not working for persons with disabilities. the ways in which in some jurisdictions in the region, we either have special needs school for persons with disabilities, and in some attempt at integrating, for instance, a person whose disability might be related to mobility, might be denied access based on the fact that schools are not designed to accommodate persons with different abilities. And so these are questions we have to return to, because we can't just think about education for so-called normative citizens. We need to think about education for all citizens. Right? The final thing I want to talk about in this presentation is the role of health and family life education and programs and life skills-based education. And I know that at the level of the regional and sub-regional level, there has been talk about rethinking the curriculum and rethinking the role of life skills-based education. And I'm going to talk about some work that I did recently in St. Vincent and the Grenadines, in which St. Vincent is in the process of designing health and family life, redesigning their health and family life education to focus on gender, to include a module on gender-based violence for the technical and vocational institutes, specifically in St. Vincent and the Grenadines. If we know anything, most of the HFLE curricula stop at third form. And they're deliberately creating one for the upper schools, but the TechVoc institutes. And what I found in some focus groups I did with teachers, with students separately, with parents, with principals, as well as curriculum specialists in the Ministry of Education, is that they were concerned that, about life skills-based education for secondary school and post-secondary school youth, and the way in which it was treated in the curriculum. They expressed concern about difficulties faced by secondary school-age children as a consequence of violence and poverty in particular, and felt that life skills-based education was essential in addressing some of those needs for this specific group of students. They also felt that it might function as a source of support, but the problem with it is that oftentimes not just the curriculum, the HFLE curriculum, but also the teachers teaching in that curriculum are marginalized within schools. So it is treated as an imposition on the curriculum. We have to find this 2-hour period, 40 minutes on one day and another 40 minutes on another day, and that is crowding out our space to teach the 20 subjects we want students to do at CXC. And that is extremely problematic, because I was able to meet some amazing HFLE teachers who are committed to what they're doing and very well informed. But their experience of feeling marginalized in the staff room and in the school space is problematic for some of the very reasons Alison raised. The role of education ensuring that we do that kind of work, not just with our girls and our boys, but with our population. Around gender-based violence and so on. So that was very troubling for me in hearing their concerns. One teacher reported that children are sometimes punished for asking questions about sex and sexuality in classrooms, and teachers needed to be better prepared and willing to address students' concern in ways that would promote a better understanding about the operation of gender and sexuality. The teachers also spoke to concerns about homophobia among students and violence towards gender non-conforming students in schools, and actual situations they had to address. They felt that life skills offered a degree of flexibility and activity-based learning that the rest of the curriculum could benefit from, and I tend to agree with them. They felt that life skills education should be mainstream throughout subjects across the curriculum, and it just should not just stand as a one-off. That they felt that if that happened, they would get the kind of support they need to do their intervention. And finally, they felt that social workers, in talking to all of them, they felt that it was essential to the overall development of school-age youth. Interestingly, the students were very, very strong advocates. And some of the students I spoke to were already in the TechVoc institutes, and they talked about missing 3 years of life skills education because it stopped when they were in third form. And the final thing I want to just say very quickly is that at the University of the West Indies, about 2 years ago, we launched a new 5-year strategic plan in which we focus on three strategies: access, which has to do with, sort of our role or our commitment to teaching, research, and policy and so on, policy advising, as well as ensuring that our academic programming are aligned with, activism. The university sees itself as an activist university. We have no choice but to be, because we are in the Caribbean and that's who we are and that's what we're supposed to do. That's the service we're supposed to offer. And that we are committed to this core principle of gender justice. The reason why I say this is that as someone who I've worked in the secondary school system and I've taught at university. And I think it's really important for us not to be siloed in where we find ourselves, that there's no university without the pre-university school system. And that any kind of change that has to happen has to go all the way through the school system. So we have to turn the lens on ourselves as well, right? I just really want to thank you for your time, and I look forward to the opportunity to discuss some of these issues a bit further. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Deschamps. Actually, before the end of this session, you will have an opportunity to pose your questions. The panelists are here, and they would be ready and willing to answer the questions that you have. Remember, if you look at your program, you'll see discussion, questions, and answers before we close out this session 1 at 1 o'clock this afternoon. The next presentation will be a virtual presentation, and that would be done by Mrs. Lebretta Nana Oye Hasebin, Executive Director of Shida Sustainable Development Solutions Limited. As I said, that would be a virtual presentation. I've been sent the profile, which I'll now read. Lebretta Nana Oye Hasebin is the founder and executive director of Shida Sustainable Development Solutions Limited, SSDS. Professionally known by her middle name, Nana, she is a social economist and gender expert with over 20 years international experience, acquired in countries such as the Caribbean, United Kingdom, and the United States of America, while working with governments, non-governmental organizations, and international organizations. Her technical competencies are in policy development, strategic planning, results-based program management, research, proposal writing, monitoring and evaluation, social science training, workshop facilitation, social and gender impact assessments, and the development and conduct of social development surveys. She has worked in the broad thematic areas of poverty reduction, citizen security, gender and development, sexual and reproductive health, governance, women's political participation, economic empowerment, disaster risk reduction, social statistics, knowledge management, youth-related issues, and sustainable livelihoods. Nana holds a Master's of Economic and Social Studies degree in Development Management, specializing in poverty reduction and sustainable livelihoods. from the University of Wales in the United Kingdom, and she also has a Bachelor of Arts. In fact, Bachelor of Art degrees in Economics and French with a minor in pre-law from the Indiana University of Pennsylvania in the United States of America. Prior to SSDS, Nana was a consultant with the United Nations Resident Coordinator's Office in Trinidad and Tobago, where she provided technical assistance to the UN Resident Coordinator and the UN Country Management Team on joint United Nations development projects, work plans, and programs, including the coordination and development of the United Nations 2014 to 2015 Development Assistance Framework for the government and people of Trinidad and Tobago. Working in social development for Nana is more than just a job. To her, it is a unique privilege to affect lives and advocate on behalf of persons who understand their limitations and yet have the faith and hope that the right individuals will work together with them to bring about the change that is needed in their communities. Ladies and gentlemen, we will now have the virtual presentation by Nana. Put your hands together, please.
Hello, good morning. Okay, maybe I probably should show my face a little bit before I start the presentation. Hi, I'm so sorry I couldn't be with you in Nevis. I had every intention of being there, but circumstances did not make it possible. So I'm hoping that this presentation will be able to convey what the Nevis administration, the government of St. Kitts and Nevis, hopes to achieve in this conference. I'm now going to start. Am I being heard? Can I be heard? Okay, all right. You can see my screen now? Okay, wonderful. So my difference with and I will run out of time, so I'm sure the chair will guide in terms of when we get to how we're going to handle next. But before a few moments, I want to talk to you about gender mainstreaming, budgeting, defense, that's challenges to OECS. My presentation outline gives an introduction. We'll look at gender mainstreaming definition and the whole concept of gender mainstreaming. Talk about some of the achievements in the OECS, the gaps and the challenges. We'll also then look at gender budgeting, definition and concept, achievements in the OECS, the gaps and the challenges, and then we'll have a discussion on the next steps and gender mainstreaming and gender budgeting in the OECS. So in 1997, ECOSOC, basically, which is the Economic and Social Council of the United Nations, defined gender mainstreaming as a process of taking implications for women and men of any planned action, including legislation, policies, programs in all areas and at all levels. Gender mainstreaming, and that is to make men as well as women's concerned experience several dimensions of design, implementation, monitoring, evaluation of policies, programs in all political, economic, societal spheres, so that men and women benefit equally and inequality is perpetuated. So in streaming is gender equality. Now, making sure implications of any planned action, such as legislation, policies, or programs, really affect or it's looking at the lives of men and boys and how it really affects them, is what we term as gender analysis. That's a full process of gender analysis, which is integral to gender mainstreaming to take place. Now, this will definitely also then require that you have disaggregated data. And of course, this will then give you implications of the representation of men, women, and sex. What is actually happening to men? What is actually happening to women? Gives you the opportunity to then further see what actions can be taken to mitigate if takes place, if it proceeds. Now, gender mainstreaming takes place when you're looking at a project or a program or a policy in the full project cycle, which is from concept. So you have to think of gender mainstreaming from the concept phase, plan phase, the implementation phase, and monitoring value phase. So it's not a one-off activity, but it actually throughout the full cycle of the project policy implementation is going on. So what gives the OECS the mandate to work gender mainstreaming? First, it comes from the international commitments that the OECS has to, which includes the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, that is CEDAW, includes the Beijing Platform for Action. It includes the International Conference on Population Development, which is the ICPD, the Sustainable Development Goals, Legal Framework for Action, and of course there are other commitments, but I just wanted to highlight these presently. So what are some of the achievements that the OECS have made in terms of mainstreaming? Countries have gender machines, which is the institutional framework really applies to mainstream to establish in all the countries. And this has been for quite some time. There are strong programs in the OECS to address violence against women. I want to highlight Antigua and Barbuda's one-stop crisis center. Now, this crisis center differs a little bit from other countries who also deem to have a crisis center. In the crisis center of Antigua and Barbuda, what I observed is that under one roof, all the services for violence against women takes place. So you have the police there, the counselors that are there, the medical officials that are there, and a recently added feature of it is it's actually a safe space for vulnerable witnesses to actually
believe Nana,
yeah?
Currently the reception is extremely poor, so I'm afraid that we will have to, cut that presentation. And I guess we figure out a way to get the presentation because the reception is extremely poor. I guess it has something to do with the internet speed. And so we are not hearing you very well. It's very difficult, to connect the sentences and so on.
Okay.
So we humbly apologize.
Okay. Say that again, please.
okay if you can send the presentation electronically, we would be grateful.
It was already sent.
Yes. Okay, it was sent already, okay. So. Well, I guess you can run the slides. Run the slides, yes. Nana, are you still hearing us? Are you still with us?
I am still here.
Okay. Okay, we're going to try the slides, Nana.
Okay.
Okay, you can take off your photo. Just the video. Okay, the camera, you can take that off and let's see what happens here. Okay, go right ahead.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
It's clearer? Okay, wonderful. All right, so as I was sharing, the Crisis Center in Antigua and Barbuda has all the services under roof, makes it easier for survivors and victims to get assistance in one location without having to move all over the ICC services. Now, what is also good for the OECS is that this is actually the Caribbean's first section of that is in Antigua. So it's actually a model that other OECS countries can really look to emulate and probably have in their countries as well. Another thing actually is gender issues are almost national. In other words, although some persons might not have correctly or the definition correctly, they do understand what gender is talking about, it is about. So that is an achievement for the OECS that the gender machineries have actually made in raising awareness. Another achievement for the OECS is the analysis of economic, social, and sectors of the countries, that is the country gender assessments, which were conducted by the Caribbean Development Act. In other words, the OECS has two that, in other words, research that has been done. Okay, just a second. I was told I need to, but if you turn up the video, you will be able to see my screen. Will you present the presentation there? Because I'm sharing my screen right now. Okay, let me see how I can do that. Give me a second to do that. Is it better? Can you hear me, Clara? It's Clara? Okay, nice. Let me just increase the... Okay. Alright, okay, can I go ahead now? Okay. So as I was saying, the OECS countries already have tools which they can use for gender mainstreaming, the country gender assessment, which all the OECS countries have. Another achievement is the gender training and sensitization, which is conducted by most of the machineries. In other words, training is not only up to public sector workers, but also to the private sector, to civil society and organizations in the community. In other words, the information is out there in terms of what gender is all about. Now, one of the achievements, example which was given was in Finland, where they actually also train the private sector to gender mainstream, which gives them the opportunity to also develop gender policies within their organization. So I thought was a great thing. Another achievement is the Gender Advice Committee. So there is a committee in America, and the NADA also has the National Organization of Women. Now, what these committees does is they act as an advisory overarching committee that looks at how the ministry is mainstreaming gender nationally. Another achievement is the mainstreaming of gender in national development plans. Now, this has not been achieved by all.
Okay. No, we will, I think, have to cut the presentation here because you're still breaking up very badly. So we will just, leave it here.
My camera's up.
Okay, so at this...
Maybe what you can try is, instead of me sharing my screen, you can put the presentation up. I don't know if you want to try it. I emailed it to...
Okay, we have decided just to cut the presentation and just move on to the discussion, questions and answers. All right, so thank you very much. I'm sorry about that, but...
Not a problem.
Yes, thank you. All right, you would have heard presentations on the education system by Dr. Deschamps, repositioning our education system to overcome gender stereotypes and break down the gender divide. And you would have also heard from Ms. Drayton here on access to sexual and reproductive health services by adolescents in the OECS, a situational analysis. You have time for questions, comments, whatever. And so at this point in time, the floor is now open to you. Our panelists are ready to respond to your questions, to your comments. So, okay, I think we have a first question here. Please identify yourself and then pose your question or make your comment. Thanks. Excuse me, is there a mic available to go around? If you can. Yes, good morning. My question was, I was curious to know, maybe you said it and I missed it, but I was curious to know how you're defining unmet needs with regard to sexual reproductive health.
Do you want to take those questions or do it one by one? So I have never been accused of having a soft dosage voice. Let me just say I'm pretty sure that I could have projected from where I was. Unmet need for family planning is where I was going to say a woman, but I guess a person would like to access contraceptives, but for one reason or another cannot. Be it legislative, be it availability, be it something else. So that's how we define the unmet need. It's expressed as a desire, they can't get it for whatever the reason.
Yeah.
All right, okay, Mr. Daniel, okay, we'll let the Miss Masai and then we'll come to you. Ladies first, is all right? All right.